Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah.
The first measurement I'll take is the chest line, which is 11 inches. After that, I'm going to measure my under bust, which is 14 inches. Then I'm going to measure my waistline plus half an inch sewing allowance. I'm going to label it my bust point, under bust, and waistline. I'm going to mark half of my shoulder measurement. From the mark point, I'll go down by 1 inch. Then I'll mark the standard neck measurement, which is 3 inches. I'll connect the lines together to get my shoulder slope. To get my armhole measurement, all I did was to measure my bust by 6 inches. Then I added 1.5 to it. Once I have gotten that, I'm going to connect from the point to my shoulder measurement. I'm going to extend the line, so this will be our chest line. The next measurement I'll mark is half of my nipple to nipple measurement. I'll mark it on my bust point to my waistline. I'm going to get half of my shoulder measurement. I'll mark it. Then I'm going to connect it to my bust point right there. On the part going towards the center front, I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch. That's 0.7 on both the waistline and the under bust. This is because my client is on the bigger side, but if you are quite slim, you can mark half of an inch. On the side going towards the side seam, I'm going to mark 1/4. That's 1 and 7 inches, but if you're on a smaller size, you can mark 1.5. On my bust point, I'm going to go down by 1 inch. After that, I'll connect it with a curve. I'll connect both sides with a curve. From the chest line, I went up by 2 inches. I'm going to mark it. I actually changed my mind and I went down by half of an inch, so that makes it 1.5 inches, but I should have left it at the 2 inches. On the side going towards the armhole, I measured the 0.7 inch, while the side going towards the center front, I measured 1 inch. Then I'm going to connect them to my bust point. You can actually use a curved rule for this. You don't have to use a ruler. I'm going to use that curved part to smoothen the edge. On the armhole length, I'm going to measure half of the armhole length, then I'll mark it. After that, I'm going to go in by half of an inch from the marked point. On my chest line, I'm going to measure 1/4 of my bust. I'll mark it. Then I'm going to connect my lines from my armhole to my bust measurement. Next I'm going to do is to measure my dart intake on the chest line. Then I'm going to replace it back on the chest line right there. On my waistline, I'm going to measure 1/4 of my waist measurement. After I have gotten that, I'm going to measure my dart intake. Then I'll replace it back to my waistline. I'll go ahead and connect my lines from my chest line to my waistline. The next thing I did was to mark my neck depth, which was 3 inches. Yeah, so I'll just connect it with a curve. Because I want my neckline to be just straight, I actually connected it with a curve towards my armhole from that point. After that, I added half an inch sewing allowance to my shoulder. Once I'm done with all the measurements, I will go ahead and cut out my pattern. For the back pattern, I've already backed out my measurement, the shoulder, the chest line, bust point, under bust, and the waistline. The other difference is that I marked 1.5. This is for my zip. Also, I started taking my measurement from that 1.5 inch. On my armhole line, I'm going to measure half of my armhole, then I'll mark it, then I'll go in by half of an inch. Next thing I did was to measure 1/4 of my bust measurement. I marked it. Then I added 2 inches sewing allowance. So I connected the lines from my shoulder to my bust. On my waistline, I'm going to mark half of my nipple to nipple measurements. Then I'll mark it. I'll also mark it on my chest line too. I'll go ahead and connect them with a straight line. Then on my chest line, I'm going to mark 1/2 inch on both sides. Then I'll connect them towards my chest line. Next thing I did was to mark quarter of my waistline. Then I marked it. After that, I measured my dart intake, which is 1 inch. Then I added it to my waistline measurement. After that, I added 2 inches sewing allowance to it. Then I'm going to connect my lines from the chest line to my waistline. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to measure my neck depth, which was 1/1/4. Then I just connect it with a cuff row. After that, I added 1/2 inch sewing allowance to my shoulder. On my chest line, I went up by 1/2 inch. On my waistline, I'm going to go in by 1/2 inch. Then I'll connect it to my chest line. Once I'm done with all of this, I'm going to cut out my pattern. I'll be cutting my lower part, that's the skirt part. I'll be cutting that next. I'll take out measurement of my upper part, that's 17 inches from my normal gown length. So that will be the length of my lower part. I'm going to go ahead and mark the length of my skirt. Once I'm done with that, next I'm going to mark is the quarter of my waist measurement. After that, I'm going to measure 1 inch for my dart intake. I'll also add 2 inches. This will be for my sewing allowance. From my waist, I'll go down by 8 inches. This is where I'll take my hip measurement. I'm going to mark quarter of my hip measurement plus 2 inches sewing allowance. After that, I'll connect my waist to my hip. On the hemline, I'm going to mark my hip measurement minus 1 inch. So if your hip measurement is like 11 inches, you have to take out 1 inch from the 11 inches. That will be 10 inches. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to connect from my hip to the hemline. I'm just giving the hip line a curved shape so I will not have any pointed edges. On the waistline, I went ahead to add 1/2 inch sewing allowance to it. Back to the hemline. On the hemline, I'm going to add 1.5 to the hem. 1/2 inch will be for sewing with the lining, while the other 1 inch will be for the pulling of the fabric with the lining. You understand this when we cut the lining. Once I'm done with all of this, I'm going to cut out my fabric. The next is to cut out the back part of our skirt. I've gone ahead to place my front on it. The only difference is that I added 1.5 inches. This is for my zip allowance. I'll go ahead and cut out the back piece. After that, I'll also cut it into 2. After I'm done with the fabric, I'll cut out my lining next. Once I get to the hem, from the initial hem line, I'm going to go down by 1/2 inch. You can actually just cut from the initial hem line itself. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to cut it out. I'll also do the same for my back piece. The next thing we're going to cut is the lace part of the skirt. I'm going to place my front piece on the lace fabric to get the exact point I want to cut from. I've actually marked that how long I want my lace to be on my normal fabric. So you can mark that, you can mark your desired length. I'm going to cut out the lace fabric now. I'll be folding the lace fabric in a V shape. Just watch how I'm doing it. After that, I'm going to press it. I'll be pinning the lace fabric on the front side of my skirt. Once I'm done pinning, I'll go to my sewing machine to stitch my lace fabric to my front skirt. Once I'm done stitching the lace on my fabric, I'll go ahead and join my fabric to my lining. The first thing I'm going to do is to stitch it by the hem. This is what it looks like after I'm done stitching. The next thing I'm going to do is just to pull the lining to the exact length of the fabric. Then I'm going to stitch the side seam. Once you get to the hem, you'll notice the fabric is actually 1 inch longer than the lining. You have to sew it like that. There's nothing to be worried about. This is what the hem of your skirt should look like once you're done. I'm going to do the same for the back piece too. I'm going to cut out my front and my back piece. I added 1/2 inch sewing allowance on the front, then 2 inches on the side. Also 1/2 inch for joining the pieces together. I've also cut out wording for it. I'll be using this as my breast pad. I'll go to my sewing machine to stitch them together. I'll also do the same for my lining. This is my back piece. I'm going to go to my sewing machine and stitch up my dart intake. Once I'm done joining, this is what the front piece looks like. I'm going to pin the front lace on it before pinning my lining too. Then I'll go to my sewing machine to sew that upper part. I'll do the same to my back piece also. After I'm done stitching that part, I'm going to stop stitch my lining and I will also stitch my side seam. The next thing I'm going to do is to join my upper part and lower part together. I'll also do this for my back piece. After I'm done joining the upper part and lower part together, I'm going to take my back piece and I'm going to stitch them together by 1 inch. This will be for my zip allowance. After I'm done with the zip, I'm going to place both front and back piece on top of each other, making sure right sides are facing each other. Then I'm going to sew my shoulder. After I'm done with my shoulder, I'll go ahead and sew my round neck. So guys, I already fixed the shoulder and the round neck, and I've also fixed the zip. The next thing for me to do is just to join the side seam, that is the front and back, to join them together. I'll also use this lace material for my sleeve. So to cut out my sleeve length, since the sleeve has a flare at the edge, I'll take out 5 inches for my sleeve length. Let's say my sleeve length is 23, I'll take out 5 inches, that's 18, plus half an inch sewing allowance to the clothes and half an inch sewing allowance to the flare, that is 19 inches. What I'm doing right here is that I'm measuring the length of my sleeve, then I'll mark it. I've actually folded my sleeve into 4 parts so that I'll cut 2 pieces of sleeve together at once. Right here, I'm going to measure half of my round armhole measurement. After that, I'll go down by 3 inches to get my sleeve curve. Then I'm going to connect my sleeve to the point, to the 3 inches point. At the wrist, I'll measure half of my wrist measurement. I'll mark that. I'm going to connect it from the sleeve opening to my wrist. Once I'm done taking my measurements, I'm going to go ahead and cut out my sleeve. Once I'm done with that, I'll go to my sewing machine and stitch the side. After I'm done stitching, I'll measure my round wrist. I'll be using this measurement for my flare. To cut the flare, I'm going to divide my wrist circumference by 6.28. Whatever I get, I'm going to mark it around the edges to get a curve. I'll be connecting the dotted line to get a curve. From the curve right there, I'm going to measure the length of my flare. The length of my flare is 5 inches. Then I'm going to add 1 inch sewing allowance to it. That will make it 6. So I'll just place my tape rule on that curve. Then I'll mark 6 inches around it. I'll go ahead and connect the dots. Once I'm done, I'll go ahead and cut out my pattern paper. To cut out my flare, I'm going to fold it 4 times. Just watch how I did it in the video. After I'm done, I'm going to place my pattern paper on the lace fabric. Then I'm going to cut it out. I've gone ahead to gather my flare because it was quite bigger than the waist measurement. I will have actually made it bigger so that it will look fuller. I'm going to pin the flare around my wrists and I'm going to stitch it once I'm done. I've gone ahead to make the other sleeve off camera. The only difference was that it was actually quite bigger than the normal bicep measurement. To fix this sleeve, I'm going to turn my dress to the wrong side. Then I'm going to just put the smaller sleeve inside the dress, as you can see in the video. Then I'm going to stitch it before attaching the long sleeve. This is what it looks like once I'm done. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. Bye.